The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered wooden platform of Millbrook Station, a forgotten outpost where the railroad had once promised prosperity, but delivered only dust and broken dreams. The wind whistled through the gaps in the station's walls, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the distant promise of rain that never seemed to come. Sarah Martinez sat on the edge of the platform, her worn blue dress pooling around her boots like spilled water. Her hands rested in her lap, trembling slightly, not from the cooling air, but from something deeper, something that had been eating at her soul for weeks. The tears fell silently down her cheeks, each one catching the golden light before disappearing into the dust below. She had been waiting for 3 hours now, watching the empty tracks stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The telegram in her coat pocket felt heavier than iron, its words burned into her memory. Regret to inform you. Thomas Martinez, killed in mining accident, body recovered, deepest condolences. The sound of horse hooves against hard earth broke through her reverie. Sarah didn't look up. She couldn't bear to see another traveler passing through, another reminder that the world kept moving while hers had stopped completely. The hooves grew closer, then stopped. She heard the creak of leather as someone dismounted, the soft jingle of spurs approaching. "Mom?" The voice was gentle, weathered like old leather but warm. "You all right?" Sarah finally lifted her eyes. The man standing before her was tall and lean, with kind brown eyes that seemed to have seen their share of sorrow. His hat was pushed back slightly, revealing sandy hair streaked with early grey. He wore a sheriff's badge on his vest, but his stance wasn't official. It was concerned, human. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice cracked on the words. Sheriff James McKenna had been riding this territory for 15 years, and he'd learned to read people like others read books. The woman before him wasn't fine. She was drowning in grief and trying to do it alone. He'd seen that look before, in his own mirror after losing his wife to consumption 5 years ago. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the platform beside her. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. McKenna settled beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. For a long moment, they sat in silence, watching the dust devils dance across the empty prairie. "I'm Sheriff McKenna," he said finally. "James McKenna. And you don't have to talk if you don't want to, but sometimes it helps to know you're not alone." Sarah turned to look at him, and in that moment, something passed between them. A recognition, a shared understanding of loss. She saw in his eyes the same hollow ache she carried, the same weight of memories that both comforted and tormented. "My husband," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's gone." McKenna nodded slowly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mom. Truly sorry." The simplicity of his words, the lack of empty platitudes, somehow made them more powerful. Sarah felt something inside her chest loosen slightly, like a knot beginning to unravel. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "I came here to collect his things, but the train's been delayed. I've been sitting here for hours and I can't seem to move." McKenna understood. After Mary died, he'd spent 2 days sitting in their kitchen, staring at her empty chair, paralyzed by the enormity of his loss. "Sometimes the world asks us to keep moving before we're ready," he said, "but there's no shame in taking time to feel the weight of what we've lost." Sarah looked at him again, studying his face. There was something in his expression, a depth of understanding that came not from pity but from experience. "You've lost someone too," she said. It wasn't a question. "My wife, Mary, 5 years ago this spring." He removed his hat, running his fingers through his hair. "Consumption took her. I thought I knew what loneliness was before that, but I was wrong." The honesty in his words broke something open in Sarah. The tears came faster now, and she didn't try to stop them. McKenna reached into his pocket and offered her a clean handkerchief. "Thank you," she whispered, accepting it. "What was his name?" McKenna asked gently. Thomas Martinez. He was a good man. Worked in the silver mines up near Leadville. Said he was going to make enough money for us to start a family, maybe buy a little house in town. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke about him. He wrote me letters every week, told me about the other miners, the sunrise over the mountains. He made that terrible place sound almost beautiful. McKenna listened, understanding the need to speak of the dead, to keep their memory alive through words. Sounds like he loved you very much. He did. Sarah's voice was firmer now, and I loved him. We only had 2 years together, but they were the best years of my life. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, McKenna made a decision. Mom, Mrs. Martinez, you shouldn't be alone right now. My sister runs a boarding house in town, clean rooms, good food, and she's got a way of making people feel welcome. Why don't you let me take you there for the night? The train won't be through until tomorrow morning anyway. Sarah hesitated. She'd been on her own for so long, learning to be independent after her parents died. But the thought of spending the night alone at the station with only her grief for company was unbearable. I couldn't impose, she said. It's no imposition. Besides, McKenna stood and offered her his hand. I think Mary would have liked you. She always said the strongest people are the ones who aren't afraid to cry. Sarah looked at his outstretched hand, then at his face. In his eyes, she saw no judgment, no pity, only genuine kindness and understanding. She took his hand and allowed him to help her to her feet. As they walked toward his horse, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks, a small spark of hope. Not for the future, not yet, but for the simple possibility that she might not have to face tomorrow alone. Thank you, Sheriff McKenna, she said, as he helped her onto his horse. James, he corrected gently, and you're welcome, Mrs. Martinez. As they rode toward the warm lights of town, neither spoke, but both understood that something had changed in those moments on the platform. Sometimes, in the vastness of grief, the smallest kindness can be the beginning of healing. The McKenna boarding house stood like a beacon against the star-filled night, its windows glowing with lamplight and the promise of warmth. Margaret McKenna, James's sister, was a woman of 45 with steel-grey hair and the kind of practical kindness that came from raising 6 children and running a business in a frontier town. James, she said as they approached the front porch, you look like you've seen a ghost. Not a ghost, Maggie, someone who needs our help. He dismounted and helped Sarah down from the horse. Mrs. Martinez, this is my sister Margaret. Maggie, this is Sarah Martinez. She's lost her husband and the train's delayed until morning. Margaret's expression immediately softened. She'd buried her own husband 3 years ago and recognized the hollow look in Sarah's eyes. Of course, dear. Come in, come in. I've got hot soup on the stove and a nice room upstairs. The interior of the boarding house was warm and welcoming, with polished wooden floors and furniture that showed the wear of love and use. The smell of beef stew and fresh bread filled the air, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt her appetite stir slightly. Sit here by the fire, Margaret said, guiding Sarah to a comfortable chair. You look chilled to the bone. As Margaret bustled about preparing a tray of food, James settled into the chair opposite Sarah. The firelight danced across his face, and she noticed the lines around his eyes, lines that spoke of laughter as well as sorrow. Your sister seems very kind, Sarah said. She is. She's been the heart of this family since our parents died. When Mary got sick, Maggie insisted on moving in with us to help. After Mary died, she stayed to make sure I ate regular meals and didn't drink myself into an early grave. Margaret returned with a steaming bowl of stew and a thick slice of bread. I heard that, she said with a slight smile, and I'll do it again if necessary. Sarah managed a small smile, the first in weeks. Thank you, Mrs. Just Margaret or Maggie, if you prefer. We don't stand on ceremony here. As Sarah ate, she found herself sharing more about Thomas, how they'd met at a church social, how he'd courted her with shy determination, how he'd promised to write every day from the mines and had kept that promise until the very end. "He sounds like a good man," Margaret said, settling into a chair with her own cup of coffee. "He was. He wanted to give me the world, but I just wanted him to come home safe." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "I kept telling him the money didn't matter, that we had enough, but he was so determined to provide for our future children." James leaned forward. "It's hard when the people we love put themselves in danger for our sake. Makes the loss feel heavier somehow." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "Yes, exactly. I keep thinking if I'd just tried harder to convince him to stay, maybe nothing would have changed," Margaret said gently. "Men like your Thomas, and like James here, they need to feel like they're protecting the people they love. Sometimes that means taking risks the rest of us wish they wouldn't." They talked late into the night, the conversation flowing between memories of the departed and observations about life in the frontier. Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months, the tension slowly leaving her shoulders. "I should let you get some rest," James said finally, noticing Sarah's eyelids growing heavy. "Actually," Sarah said, "I don't want to be alone with my thoughts right now. Could we talk a little longer?" James and Margaret exchanged a look. They both understood the fear of facing grief alone in the dark. "Of course," Margaret said. "James, why don't you make us some tea? I'll show Sarah to her room, and we can sit on the porch for a while." The room Margaret showed her to was simple but clean, with a comfortable bed and a small window overlooking the main street. Sarah set down her small traveling bag and looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand. Her reflection showed a woman aged by grief, but also a woman who had somehow found the strength to keep going. They gathered on the front porch, wrapped in blankets against the cool night air. The town was quiet, except for the occasional sound of a horse or the distant bark of a dog. Above them, the stars stretched endlessly across the clear sky. "It's beautiful here," Sarah said. "Thomas wrote about nights like this. He said the stars in the mountain seemed so close you could almost touch them." "He was a poet," James observed. "In his way, yes. He saw beauty in everything, even in the hardest times." Sarah pulled her blanket tighter. "I used to think that was foolish, but now I understand. When you know life is fragile, you appreciate every beautiful moment." Margaret nodded. "After Henry died, I spent months angry at the world. James helped me see that Henry wouldn't have wanted me to stop noticing sunsets or flowers or children laughing." "How do you do it?" Sarah asked. "How do you keep going when the person who made everything meaningful is gone?" James was quiet for a long moment. "At first you don't. You just survive one day at a time. But gradually, you start to realize that their love for you didn't die with them. It became part of who you are, and honoring that love means living, really living, not just surviving." Sarah felt tears starting again, but they were different now, less desperate, more cleansing. "I don't know how to live without him." "You don't have to figure it all out tonight," Margaret said softly. "You just have to figure out how to face tomorrow, and you don't have to do it alone." As the night deepened, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since receiving the telegram, a sense of being understood, of belonging somewhere. These people, who had been strangers just hours ago, had somehow become a lifeline. "I should go to Leadville," she said suddenly, "to collect his things, to see where he spent his last months. But I'm terrified of going alone." James looked at her steadily. "You don't have to go alone. I know the mine superintendent there, a good man named Miller. I could ride with you, help you handle the arrangements." "I couldn't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm offering." His voice was firm but gentle. "Sometimes we need someone to help us carry the weight until we're strong enough to carry it ourselves." Sarah looked at him in the dim light of the porch lamp. There was something in his eyes, not pity, but recognition. He understood her pain because he'd walked the same path. And somehow, in that understanding, she found the courage to nod. "Thank you," she whispered. "We'll leave day after tomorrow," James said. "Give you time to rest, to prepare. Maggie will help you with anything you need." As they finally said their goodnights and Sarah climbed the stairs to her room, she felt a strange mixture of sorrow and gratitude. Thomas was still gone. Nothing could change that. But she was no longer facing that reality alone. In a single day, she'd found allies in her grief, people who understood that sometimes the greatest kindness is simply refusing to let someone suffer in isolation. That night, for the first time in weeks, Sarah slept without nightmares, and in the room below, James McKenna sat by his window, thinking about the woman upstairs and the familiar pain he'd seen in her eyes. He understood her grief because he'd lived it. But he also understood something else, that helping her heal might be the key to his own healing too. The morning air was crisp and clean as James secured the last of their supplies to the pack horse. Sarah emerged from the boarding house wearing a practical riding dress and a determined expression that hadn't been there 2 days ago. Margaret had insisted on packing enough food for a small army, along with blankets and medical supplies. "You sure you're ready for this?" James asked, checking the saddle on the gentle mare Margaret had borrowed from a neighbor. Sarah took a deep breath, looking toward the mountains that rose like sleeping giants in the distance. "I'm ready to face whatever I need to face. I can't heal from something I don't understand." The ride to Leadville took them through some of the most beautiful country in Colorado territory. Rolling hills gave way to dense forests of pine and aspen, and the air grew thinner as they climbed higher into the mountains. James rode slightly ahead, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing stories about the region. "Thomas wrote about this," Sarah said, as they crested a hill overlooking a valley filled with golden aspens. "He said the trees looked like they were on fire with sunlight." He had an eye for beauty," James replied. "Must have gotten that from his wife." Sarah felt a blush creep up her neck. Over the past 2 days, she'd found herself noticing things about James. The way he listened with his whole attention, how he seemed to anticipate her needs without being asked, the quiet strength in his presence. It confused her, this awareness of another man when she was still deep in grief for her husband. They stopped for lunch beside a clear mountain stream. The water so pure, it reflected the pine trees like a mirror. As they ate Margaret's sandwiches, James shared stories about his life as a sheriff, not the dramatic tales of gunfights and outlaws, but the quieter moments of helping neighbors, settling disputes, and building trust in a community. "You love what you do," Sarah observed. "I do. It's not glamorous work, but it matters. After Mary died, it gave me purpose when I didn't think I had any left." What was she like?" "Mary?" James smiled, and Sarah saw the pain in his eyes soften into something warmer. "She was a teacher, believed every child deserved a chance to learn, no matter their circumstances. She'd stay after school to help the slower students, and she never once complained about the low pay or the long hours. She had this way of making people feel important, like their thoughts and feelings mattered." "She sounds wonderful." "She was, and she would have liked you, Sarah. She always said the strongest people are the ones who aren't afraid to be vulnerable." The use of her first name sent a small thrill through Sarah, followed immediately by guilt. How could she be having these feelings when Thomas had been gone such a short time? As if reading her thoughts, James said gently, "It's all right to feel confused. Grief doesn't follow rules, and neither does healing. Mary always said that feeling guilty about moments of happiness was like throwing away a gift." That afternoon, they reached Leadville, a rough, booming mining town carved into the mountainside. The streets were muddy and crowded with miners, merchants, and the inevitable collection of gamblers and saloon keepers that followed mineral strikes. The air was thick with smoke from the smelters and the constant noise of ore carts and machinery. James led them to a small hotel on the less rowdy end of town. "We'll get you settled, then visit the mine office," he said. "Miller's expecting us." The hotel room was sparse but clean, with a view of the mountains that Thomas must have seen every day. Sarah stood at the window, imagining her husband walking these same streets, perhaps looking up at this same view and thinking of her. "Are you ready?" James asked softly. Sarah nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly. "I need to understand what happened to him. I need to know that his last months weren't miserable." The mine office was a collection of rough wooden buildings at the base of the mountain, where the constant thunder of machinery was almost deafening. Superintendent Miller was a weathered man in his 50s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, removing his hat, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Thomas was one of our best men, hard-working, honest, and always looking out for his fellow miners." "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Can you tell me what happened?" Miller's expression grew somber. "There was a cave-in shaft number 7. Thomas was working with a new miner named Peter Walsh, young fellow, barely 18. When the support started groaning, Thomas pushed the boy to safety, but the ceiling came down before he could get out himself." Sarah felt her knees weaken, and James stepped closer, his hand gently supporting her elbow. "He died saving someone else," she whispered. "Yes, ma'am. Peter Walsh is alive today because of your husband. The boy's been asking about you, wanted to thank you in person if you felt up to it." Sarah looked at James, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd like to meet him." Peter Walsh was waiting outside the mine office, a young man with sandy hair and the kind of earnest face that hadn't yet been hardened by life. When he saw Sarah, he immediately removed his hat and approached with obvious nervousness. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm Peter Walsh. I'm the one your husband saved." Sarah studied his face, seeing in it the future that Thomas had given him, a young man who would grow up, perhaps marry, have children of his own. "Tell me about him," she said. "Tell me what he was like here." Peter's face lit up with genuine warmth. "He was like a father to me, ma'am. When I first arrived, I didn't know anything about mining. And the other men, well, they weren't always patient with greenhorns. But Thomas took me under his wing. He taught me how to read the rock, how to stay safe, how to work as part of a team." "Did he seem happy?" Sarah asked, the question that had been haunting her. "Happy? Well, he missed you something fierce, ma'am, talked about you all the time. But he was proud of the work he was doing, proud that he was building a future for you both. He used to say that every day in the mines was a day closer to bringing you home to your own place." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. But they were different tears now, tears of pride and love rather than just sorrow. "He showed me a picture of you," Peter continued. "Carried it in his shirt pocket right over his heart, said you were the most beautiful woman in the world and that he was going to spend the rest of his life making sure you knew it." Can I see where it happened?" Sarah asked. Miller and James exchanged glances. "It's not a pleasant sight, Mom," Miller said gently. "I need to see it. I need to understand." The walk to Shaft 7 was quiet except for the sounds of the mine operations. Sarah saw the place where her husband had spent his last months, the dangerous, dark world he'd entered so willingly for love of her. When they reached the sealed entrance to the collapsed shaft, she stood in silence for a long moment. "He wasn't afraid," Peter said quietly. "When he pushed me to safety, he wasn't thinking about himself at all. He was thinking about doing the right thing, about protecting someone who needed help." Sarah placed her hand on the rough wooden barrier that sealed the shaft. "That was Thomas," she said. "He always put others first." That evening, back at the hotel, Sarah and James sat on the small balcony overlooking the town. The mountain air was cold and sharp, filled with the scent of pine and the distant sound of mining operations that continued through the night. "I'm glad we came," Sarah said. "I needed to know that he wasn't suffering, that he found meaning in what he was doing." "He died as he lived," James observed, "protecting others, thinking of you." "Yes." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "James, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course. What happens now? I mean, I know I have to go back and rebuild my life, but I don't know how to do that alone. And I don't know if I should feel guilty about not wanting to be alone." James looked at her steadily. "Sarah, Thomas loved you. From everything I've heard about him, he was a good man who wanted you to be happy. I don't think he'd want you to spend the rest of your life grieving for him. But it's only been a few weeks. How can I even think about moving forward so soon? Because you're alive, James said simply, and life is precious. Thomas knew that, which is why he risked his own to save someone else. The question isn't whether you should move forward, but how you can honor his memory while still living fully. Sarah felt something shift inside her, a recognition that her grief and her capacity for new feelings didn't have to be mutually exclusive. I think I'm beginning to understand, she said softly. As they prepared to leave Leadville the next morning, Sarah felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. She had Thomas's personal effects, his letters to her, the picture of her he'd carried, a small wooden carving he'd made during quiet moments. But more importantly, she had the knowledge that he died with purpose, surrounded by people who respected him, in service to the values they'd shared. The ride back to Millbrook was quieter than the journey up, both of them lost in their own thoughts. But it was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who understand each other. As they descended from the mountains into the rolling hills of home, Sarah felt herself changing, not forgetting Thomas, but beginning to imagine a future that honored his memory while still allowing for new possibilities. "James," she said as they neared the town, "I want to thank you. Not just for coming with me, but for showing me that grief doesn't have to be a solitary journey." "Thank you for letting me help," he replied. "I think helping you heal has helped me heal too." That night, as Sarah lay in her room at the boarding house, she thought about the young man whose life Thomas had saved, about the love that had motivated her husband's sacrifice, and about the kindness of a sheriff who had refused to let her face her grief alone. She was beginning to understand that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, it inspires new connections, and it gives meaning to the choice to keep living. 3 months had passed since the journey to Leadville, and autumn had painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah had found work as a seamstress in town, her skilled hands creating wedding dresses and Sunday clothes for the families of Millbrook. The work gave her purpose and a sense of independence she'd never experienced before. She'd also become a regular visitor to the McKenna boarding house, helping Margaret with the cooking and cleaning, and slowly becoming part of the family. The arrangement suited everyone. Sarah needed the companionship, Margaret appreciated the help, and James found reasons to stop by for dinner more often than strictly necessary. On this particular evening, Sarah sat on the front porch, mending a tear in one of the boarding house's quilts. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and she could hear Margaret humming in the kitchen as she prepared dinner. It was a peaceful scene, one that had become dear to her over the past months. The sound of approaching hooves made her look up. James was riding up the path, but something in his posture suggested this wasn't a casual visit. He dismounted and walked toward the porch, his expression serious. "Sarah," he said, removing his hat, "I need to talk to you about something." She set down her sewing, immediately alert. "What is it? Has something happened?" "Nothing bad," he said quickly, seeing her concern. "It's just, I've been offered a position, sheriff of Silver Creek, about 50 miles north of here. It's a bigger town, more responsibility, better pay." Sarah felt her heart drop. "Are you going to take it?" James sat down on the porch steps, his hat in his hands. "I don't know. Part of me thinks I should. It's a good opportunity, a chance to do more meaningful work. But I'd be leaving everything I've built here. My sister, my friends, the community I've served for 15 years. He looked at her directly. "I'd be leaving you." The words hung in the air between them. Over the past months, their friendship had deepened into something more, though neither had spoken of it directly. They'd shared quiet conversations, worked together on community projects, and found comfort in each other's company. But they'd both been careful not to move too fast, conscious of Sarah's recent loss and the delicate nature of their growing feelings. "James," Sarah said softly, "you can't make a decision like this based on me. Your career, your future, those are important. So are you," he said simply. "Sarah, I know it's too soon to speak of such things, and I know you're still grieving Thomas. But I need you to know that these past months getting to know you, watching you rebuild your life with such courage, it's made me realize something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? The belief that I could love someone again. The hope that I might have a future worth building. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Oh, James, I'm not asking you to make any decisions," he said quickly. "I'm not asking you to choose between honoring Thomas's memory and having feelings for me. I just need you to know that if you think there might be a future for us, someday, when you're ready, I want to be here for it." Sarah rose from her chair and sat beside him on the steps. "Can I tell you something?" He nodded. "I've been struggling with guilt for months. Not just about Thomas's death, but about the way I feel when I'm with you. About how I look forward to your visits, how I feel safe when you're around, how I've started to imagine what it might be like to build a life with someone again." James reached over and took her hand. "That's not something to feel guilty about, Sarah. That's something to be grateful for. I know that in my mind. But my heart is still catching up." She looked at their joined hands. "I loved Thomas completely. He was my first love, my husband, the father of the children I hope to have. But he's gone, and I'm still here, still alive, still capable of feeling and hoping and dreaming." "What are you saying?" Sarah turned to face him fully. "I'm saying that I care about you, James. More than I should probably admit. I'm saying that the thought of you leaving makes me realize how much I've come to depend on your presence in my life. But I need time, not to forget Thomas or to stop loving him, but to figure out how to love him and still be open to loving someone else. Does that make sense?" James squeezed her hand gently. "Perfect sense. And I can wait, Sarah. I can wait as long as you need. What about the job in Silver Creek?" James was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "I think I'll write them a letter declining their offer. I've realized that the most important work I can do is right here, in this community, with the people I care about." "Are you sure? I don't want you to sacrifice your career for me." "I'm not sacrificing anything," he said firmly. "I'm choosing what matters most. Besides, Millbrook needs a sheriff who understands the value of staying, of building something lasting." That evening, Margaret served dinner on the front porch, sensing that her brother and Sarah needed the informal setting to continue their conversation. As they ate, they talked about their hopes for the future, not making promises, but sharing dreams. "I'd like to expand my seamstress business," Sarah said. "Maybe train other women, create jobs for families who need them." "That's a fine idea," Margaret said. "This town could use more opportunities for women to support themselves." "And I'd like to see about starting a school fund," James added. "Mary always said education was the key to a better future." "Thomas would have liked that," Sarah said. "He always regretted not having more schooling himself." As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. The guilt she'd been carrying about her growing feelings for James began to lift, replaced by a sense of possibility. She was beginning to understand that loving James wouldn't diminish her love for Thomas. It would simply be a different kind of love, born from different circumstances, but no less real or meaningful. Later, as James prepared to leave, he and Sarah stood together on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Sarah," he said softly, "I want you to know that I understand what Thomas meant to you. I'm not trying to replace him or compete with his memory. I just want to be part of whatever future you're ready to build." "I know," she said, "and I want you to know that the feelings I have for you aren't about needing to be rescued or fear of being alone. They're about genuinely caring for the man you are, your kindness, your strength, your dedication to others." James smiled. "Mary used to say that the best relationships are built on friendship and respect, as much as passion." She was wise. She was, and she would have liked you very much. As James mounted his horse, Sarah called out to him. "James?" "Yes?" "Thank you for being patient with me, for understanding that healing doesn't happen on anyone else's timeline. "Thank you for letting me be part of your healing," he replied. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning, Sarah stood in the same spot where she'd first met James, on the platform of Millbrook Station, but this time she wasn't alone with her grief. James stood beside her, along with Margaret and a dozen other townspeople who had become like family to her. They were dedicating a small memorial garden they'd created together, a peaceful spot with a bench and flowering plants where anyone could come to remember loved ones. A small plaque read, "In memory of those who loved well and lived fully." "Thomas would have loved this," Sarah said, placing a bouquet of wildflowers beside the plaque. "He would have been proud of you," James replied. "Proud of how you've rebuilt your life, how you've found ways to honor his memory while still living fully." Sarah looked around at the faces of her friends and neighbors, at the garden they'd created together, at the life she'd built from the ashes of her grief. She thought about Thomas, about the love they'd shared and the sacrifice he'd made. She thought about Peter Walsh, now married and expecting his first child. She thought about the women who worked in her expanded seamstress shop, supporting their families with dignified work. "I'm ready," she said quietly to James. "Ready for what?" "Ready to start planning our future together. Ready to love again without guilt. Ready to believe that having a second chance at happiness doesn't diminish the love I had for Thomas." James smiled, the same warm smile that had first made her feel safe in her darkest hour. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure, because I've learned that love isn't a finite resource. The more we give, the more we have to give. And I think we could build something beautiful together." As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Sarah and James walked hand in hand toward the boarding house. Behind them, the memorial garden caught the last light of day, a testament to the truth that love endures, that grief can coexist with hope, and that sometimes the most beautiful futures are built on the foundation of what came before. In the distance, the evening train whistled as it approached the station, bringing new travelers to Millbrook, but Sarah didn't look back. She was no longer the broken woman who had cried silently on the platform. She was someone who had learned to honor the past while embracing the future, someone who understood that healing doesn't mean forgetting, and that the greatest tribute to lost love is the courage to love again.